Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is our second in a three-part pandemic influenza infectious disease staff professional development. Last week we had our first staff professional development, which was the review of the national response structure and the response planning framework. Today we have we're fortunate enough to have Professor Dr. Carol Byerly with us to discuss the 1918 influenza. And the next week, we will have a discussion on both ARNORTH and NORTH's current plan structure and the way ahead for planning. A few added notes. There's some restroom latrines in the back, the exits in the back and to my right and left. There's a handout that you were given when you walked in. That handout is one of the slides that Dr. Byerly will speak to during the presentation. And then also, if you have any questions, Dr. Byerly wants us to be in engaging conversation, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I will be in the back. I'll come over to you with the microphone for you to ask a question. As some of you might be wondering why you are here and what the 1918 pandemic influenza has to do with contemporary planning efforts. Many might argue that PIID is no different than any of our other DISCA operations. I believe the 1918 experience will tell you otherwise. Unlike a hurricane or an earthquake, where we are an external force responding to an event, during a PIID we are both victims and responders. During World War I, more soldiers died from influenza than combat. In addition, while we strive not to be late to need after a hurricane, the 1918 influenza experience shows us how the Army can unwittingly spread disease if precautions are not taken and sick soldiers deployed. Finally, the deaths of roughly 5% of the world's population from the 19 influenza provides us a sense of how tragic a PIID event can be, and the Center for Disease Control's recent statement that it is not if a pandemic will hit, but when, tells us that our modern medicine might not be able to stop a similar tragedy in the future. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Carol Byerly here to discuss the 1918 pandemic influenza and its effect on the Army. Dr. Carol Byerly is a lecturer in the University of Colorado's Department of History, where she specializes in the history of medicine, World War I, and U.S. history. Dr. Byerly received her PhD from the University of Colorado in 2001, and her dissertation, Fever of War, the Influenza Epidemic in the U.S. Army during World War I, was published by New York University Press in 2005. From 2002 to 2011, Dr. Byerly served as a contract historian for the U.S. Army Office of the Surgeon General, writing a new book entitled Good Tuberculosis Men, the U.S. Army Struggle with Tuberculosis, which is pending publication with the Fordham Institute at Fort Detrick. In addition to her two books, Dr. Byerly has written numerous articles, book reviews, and encyclopedia entries focused on the effects of disease on military organization. Dr. Byerly also co-authored the Panama Canal in an enterprise and served as an advisor and participant to the PBS American Experience program, Panama Canal, Gateway to the American Century, which first aired in January 2011. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Byerly spent 15 years in politics, both in Washington, D.C. and Colorado, working for 3 members of Congress as a health policy lobbyist for Children's Hospital and the American Red Cross Blood Program. She also served in the Peace Corps and the Rural Development Program in the Venezuelan Andes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Byerly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today about something that I've written on, influenza in the Army. I'm here to tell you a cautionary tale. And I want to tell you a story about what disease can do to the military and what disease can do to the society. And during World War I, the Army had the best physicians and the best scientists in the country, in the Army, serving in the Army. And influenza defeated them. And as we've been told, the CDC now says it's not a question of if we're going to have another pandemic of influenza or respiratory disease, it's when. So I can't tell you about the future, but I can tell you about what happened the last time we had a pandemic. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. The 1918 influenza was the worst plague in human history, both for how many people it killed, but how quickly it killed. It killed about 50 million people in 18 months. The death toll for World War I was about 12 million people, and we all know that World War I was horrific. The Black Death and the epidemics of the New World were catastrophic, but they happened over decades, over centuries. But the influenza killed an estimated 50 million people in 18 months. The original death toll was calculated by E.O. Jordan in the 1920s, and he said 21 million, which was pretty bad and was the number we used through most of the 20th century. And then someone studied the mortality in India and estimated that 17 million people probably died in India alone during that pandemic. And then last year, a study was done in Japan and increased the death rate from pandemic influenza from under 500,000 to about 2 million. So we're still learning more about the damage, and the number is about 50 million. And this is not a medieval plague. This is an epidemic that happened in the 20th century. It's an epidemic that happened after we had germ theory, after we had modern sanitation, after we had vaccines, after we had surgery, after we had x-rays. So I also want to make a point that with regard to influenza, it's not just the mortality. It's not just the people that die that is so devastating. It's the morbidity. It's the sickness rate. And the morbidity from pandemic flu was anywhere between 20 to 40%. 20 to 40%. And that means in the United States, the population of the United States during World War I was very conveniently 100 million. It helps history majors who aren't good at numbers. So if it's 25% of 100 million people, about 25 million people were sick in the United States during epidemic influenza in 1918. And about 2 to 4% of those people died, which gives us a death toll about 675,000. The War Department's most conservative count for influenza, and this is what they recorded, is 26% of the Army. And the Army during World War I grew to about 4 million. And so that means, rounded off, 1 million people were sick. And so next chart, please. So here, this is from a book by Leonard Ayers, who was a statistician with the Army during World War I. He was a statistician at Columbia. But this chart shows us, I need to get over here. This moves with me, doesn't it? Okay, so this shows that more people died of disease during World War I than died in battle. And so this contradicts what we've heard about other armies. But this is something I want to draw your attention to. Of course, more people died in France because they were fighting the Germans, but what are those people in the United States dying of? 36,000. So, and those people are dying of disease. 36,000 young men died before they even got a chance to go to France. And please interrupt for questions. I'm a teacher, and I like to engage my students, so you can just ask me questions. Next slide, please. So what was the disease that people were dying of? You saw that death from disease, pneumonia. And so what the influenza didn't kill by itself, but we now know, and this is research has shown that it was secondary pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, streptococcus, staphylococcus, pneumococcus, that was really accounted for 85% of the deaths from disease. And this is so, and pneumonia also killed after measles. The Army, and as you know, the Army counts everything. And it's not, and it was no different in World War I. And all of this is really well documented by the Army Medical Department, which makes it a joy for me to be able to go back and explore. The Army Medical Department lost a staggering 8,743,000 man days to influenza. 8 million days among enlisted men. And the Navy recorded a sickness rate of about 40% of 600,000 men. Yes? Microphone. Oh, I can. Okay, okay.
Okay, so just doing the math. 8 million man days, 1 million people, the length of the sickness is 8 days. When we use the number of 25%, that's not 25% all at one time. Or is it?
It's calculated in over a year.
Because it's over an 18-month period.
Right, but over an 18-month period, but they're peaks.
Right, what's the
There are
average
peaks.
time of illness
There's,
when somebody was diagnosed?
well, an epidemic when it would sweep through a camp was about 6 weeks. But a person would be sick, and it varied. If you got the flu, you didn't always get pneumonia. A lot of people were just sick, and so it would vary. But you could be sick for a week, 10 days. If you got pneumonia, it would be a number of weeks, because this is pre-antibiotics. Okay, and we'll be getting into this more. So what I'm going to argue today is that, among a number of things, is that the influenza interfered with the conduct of the war. It interfered with the military's ability to conduct the war both overseas and at home in the training camps. And I also want to argue that it traumatized a generation of medical personnel. You know, I'm going to need a little glass of water or something. I get all worked up about this stuff. Next chart, please. The influenza came in 3 waves. And our CG knows that the first wave started in Camp Riley, we believe, in a number of camps in the spring of 1918. It was reported flu going through Camp Oglethorpe, and it was enough to be written up by some of the medical officers in these camps, but really didn't kill anybody. It was a regular flu wave. And then, next chart, please. And this shows you where the camps were in the United States. So we had about 50 Army training camps for World War I. So we believe, and this is one of the reasons, is because the military was took such good records and recorded all of this. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So these are the troop ships. So the troops they're rushing to try to get the army over to France to support the Allies. Took them a long time to do that. And so the troop transports were quite crowded. They were stacked 4, as you can see, 4 men. And so we believe that the influenza virus traveled across the Atlantic with the troops going over to France, and then was able to flourish in these crowded conditions. Influenza then appears in Europe in the spring of 1918, and we have reports of influenza in the British armies and the German armies in the summer. Again, not stunning, not horrible, but flu. But then it starts to mutate. And after I wrote my book, I came across a study by Alan M. Chesney, who was running an AEF hospital in Val d'Honne in France. And he was no slouch. He later became dean of the medical school at Johns Hopkins. But he was in charge of a hospital there, and he documented the increased virulence of the flu in his hospital. Next slide, please.
Hey, ma'am, quick question. Was the influenza bacterial or was it a virus?
It's a virus.
It was a virus. Where did it originate? Did they determine that?
No,
I heard
there's
someplace
numbers.
in Kansas at a big farm was one.
Yeah, that's what Fort Riley. Yes, and so that's that's the best theory, is that it emerged in the Midwest and emerges first in Camp Funston at Fort Riley. But there are the scientists who have looked at that use words as like conundrum and speculative and unknown, so we still don't know exactly where it originated. But we could track it with the military. Again, crowded conditions in France that enable viruses to spread. Next slide, please. This should be my Chesney slide. So let me explain this. So he's in charge of a hospital, and the 5th Artillery Brigade arrives from June to July, and they're training. And he records 77 cases of influenza and no deaths. And they move out, go to the front, and then from July 23rd, July 27th to August, in the 58th Brigade, about 6.5% of the unit, or 200 men, become sick with influenza, a dramatic increase. And such that Chesney had the whole place scrubbed down before the next unit came in. And then from August to November, there were 1,636 cases of influenza and 151 deaths in this one place in France. And I believe that this shows the progression of virulence of this virus, that it is mutating in this population. And what Chesney concluded was these successive outbreaks tended to be more progressively more severe, both in character and extent, which would speak for an increasing virulence of the causative agent. They knew what was happening. They were watching it happen. And they knew that it was going to be hard to stop. The second deadly wave exploded then in late August, early September 1918, and it circled the globe. And one way we can measure the extent of the flu around the globe is that it peaked. It peaked in its power the second week of October in Boston, in Brest, France, and in Bombay, India. And so it's just exploded around the world. And then the next slide, please. So there's our big, and then there's a third wave in early 1919 that swept the globe and is implicated in complicating the Versailles Treaty talks, making people like President Wilson sick. And then it disappeared. And what happened to it is some people say it burned out. It had infected everybody it could, and there was no one else who was immune, or that it mutated back into a less virulent form. We don't know. So, two horrifying characteristics about this influenza. Next slide, please. That is the explosiveness of it. It had a gestation period, incubation period of like 24 to 48 hours. And so people knew when it hit their camp, because that is the explosive, that's the death rate in the camps in the Army. It was not subtle. And it's a word that I see in the record over and over again. It exploded. And so people know the day that it arrived in their camps. And I've given you a chart that shows that. The chart that I handed out gives the date of the arrival of the flu at every camp, which is amazing. I mean, a lot of diseases are just more nuanced, but there's nothing nuanced about influenza. Next slide, please. And ask me questions. You're good at, please, I enjoy the questions. This is one of the most troubling aspects of the flu. Normally, influenza has a U curve for mortality, and that means it kills the very young and the very old. And that's what pneumonia does generally. It's this old man's disease, and it kills the very young. This particular, thank you, this one had what we call the terrible W curve, which is that the peak for the curve right here is for people ages 20 to 40, young adults, the healthiest, most fit people, the people in the military. And so this was another horrible, it's killing the very fittest people. And we're not quite sure why. And some theories are that the immune systems of young people are especially strong, and so they flooded the lungs with antiviral reaction, but we don't know. But this is a fact that more people of that age died. Now, people knew this was happening. The physicians, the scientists knew this was happening, knew this was flu, but they didn't know the agent. There was not virology during World War I. We didn't have microscopes powerful enough to see viruses until the 1930s. And so they had a theory about a virus, but they couldn't see viruses. Some people, they were doing autopsies. The Army did autopsies on almost everybody who died, trying to understand what is happening and finding these leaden, soggy lungs. And a lot of these lungs had bacteria in them that they could see with their microscopes. And so there were theories about bacteria as the causative agent. And the next slide, please. Yeah.
Regarding we're looking at camps, there were a number of camps.
Pardon?
You had a number of camps you could look at in terms of statistics.
Right.
When the disease hit those camps, or the virus hit those camps, what were the most effective measures across the camps that you may have seen? So was it social distancing that slowed it down? Was it the medical treatment? Was it sanitation? Was it diet?
And I'm going to speak to that.
Okay.
So anticipating me, just like my students do. And subsequent, well, some of these camps tried to do quarantines, but how do quarantines work in wartime? They don't work very well in wartime. And some of the medical officers, the Surgeon General, there was an acting Surgeon General at this time, he was saying, stop the draft. We don't need new people coming into the camps while we have epidemics. And so in my book, it describes the correspondence between Peyton March, who was a commanding general in the United States, and the Surgeon General, and they're saying, no, we've got to fight the war. We can't stop the war because of an epidemic. And so we can talk about that more. But social distancing, yes, but it was very difficult and controversial, especially in wartime. Okay, so now can I have the next slide? So medical officers, next slide, please. Okay. Medical officers, again, were stunned by this and tried to understand it. So a lot of times they would take tissue from the deceased soldiers and send it to the Army Medical Museum. And so this was kept in the museum, put in wax, actually, room temperature wax. And you may have heard about Jeffrey Taubenberger, who was an Army pathologist, was looking for a research project a decade ago. And someone said, well, there's this flu tissue in the vault you might want to look at. And so he was able to take some of this tissue, and this particular sample, I believe, is from the lungs of Roscoe Vaughn, who is a young man, a 21-year-old trainee in Camp Jackson, South Carolina, who died in September 1918. So we know who it was and whose lung tissue it was. And Jeffrey Taubenberger and his team were able to do analysis on the tissue and identify the virus as H1N1 virus. And that was in 2005. So now we know what the virus was. And Jeffrey Taubenberger and David Morans have continued to do research, and I try to read what they write so I understand better the science. So those are kind of the big numbers, the big picture of what we've seen. What are some of the witnesses that I can speak to? Next slide, please. Oh, and next slide, please. Navy Surgeon General William Braisted pinpointed the arrival of the influenza epidemic in the United States to Tuesday, the 27th of August, 1918. I mean, historians love this because you can really do history and really track things. But he believed, and they've documented that it arrived in the Commonwealth Pier in Boston that day, and there was reports of 3 cases of influenza committed to the sick list. And the next day, there were 8 cases. And the next day, there were 58 cases. And 15 of whom were so ill they had to go to the hospital. And the same day, 3 of the medical officers who examined the first patients fell ill as well. By 8th of September, the flu had arrived at Camp Devens, and within 10 days, the base hospital and the infirmaries were overwhelmed. So again, within 10 days, the first patient, and within 10 days, the hospitals have thousands of patients. And they don't have the staff, and they don't have the beds, and they don't have the blankets, but they have the sick people, and they have the responsibility to take care of these people. From there, next slide, please. We know how the influenza spread. And you can see it begins up at Camp Devens, and that's the earliest date. This is by date. So it spreads from the northeast across the country. And then how do you think it gets from Devens to Chicago so quickly? With railroads and troops, right. I mean, and it's in the civilian population too, but we have really good records, and we're in wartime, and so we know it's traveling with the troops as well. Next chart, please, or next image, please. This is the chart that is illegible, but I handed it out to you. And this is a chart that shows the camps in the United States, the dates that the flu arrived, and it took about 2 months to sweep through the country, but once it hit a camp, it was about a 6-week experience. And I think the most important thing to point out is the percentage of influenza in each camp. And it ranges from 8% to 55%. And these are hospital admissions. These are records that the hospitals are keeping. These are not people that just aren't feeling well. And so this is taking over the nation. And they know it. They know what's happening. Those guys, if you can go back to the previous slide, they could see it coming. And there's a lot of correspondence where people are saying they're doing daily reports on the rates of the epidemic. And they're saying it's going to come here next. But they're at wartime, where are a lot of the officers, the medical officers? They're in France. And so there are people, they don't have ambulances. A lot of the good ambulances has gone to France. So a lot of the materiel had gone to the war, because we're at the peak of our fighting in France at this time. So anyway, they could see it coming, and some were better at preparing than others. Next slide, please. Or where we were. Next slide, please. Okay. The symptoms. The onset was quick, as I showed you the explosive. It was high fever, about 104 degrees, and universally talked about exhaustion, torpor. Medical officer George Soper, who is famous for tracking down Typhoid Mary, but he's a witness for us, said, the onset is sudden. The patient can often tell the exact moment of his attack. In the typical case, he is very sick, wholly incapacitated for exertion. He lies curled up and can hardly be roused for food. Most patients survived, and this is at Camp Funston. It's hard to see, but one of the measures they took to prevent transmission is they had the cots head to foot. But everything is, of course, put in gymnasiums, because the challenge here is to prevent pneumonia. And again, they know that. They know that a case of flu, you can get over a case of flu, but if it turns into pneumonia, there's very little to do except keep them warm and fed and rested. And again, we don't have antibiotics until the 1940s for influenza. If it turns to deadly pneumonia, then it's very scary. And observers talk about a bluish cast to the skin, kind of scary bluish cast to the skin, a blood-producing cough, and people could die in 48 hours. And this was horrific for these medical officers who are watching their patients die. You saw that 36,000 number in the training camps. They just arrived for a few weeks, and there they are, dying. Some would be bedridden for 2 weeks or more and weakened. So it's a terrible drain on manpower. And not only for the people that are sick, but for the people who are caring for them. Next slide, please. It doesn't just hit the military, it hits the society, of course. The people are totally integrated. People are going home, visiting the camps. But in Colorado, and this is a slide from Seattle, but since I teach in Colorado, I tell them what was happening in Boulder, Colorado. It arrived September 19th in Boulder, and it arrived in, first student was a student in the Army Training Corps, and the University of Colorado had a student Army Training Corps training engineers for the war and mechanics. And out of a student population of 1,000, which is a nice number for a historian, 300 got sick. So that is the 30% morbidity rate. And 19 students died, which is a 2% rate. The school was closed for 5 weeks. And from October to Armistice Day, and it was Armistice Day, the quarantine is lifted, but I don't think for medical reasons, right? I mean, they're lifting the quarantine because it's Armistice Day and you can't keep everybody home. 64 civilians died in Boulder, and in Denver, 1,500 people died. The first person to die in Denver was a college student. Again, the terrible W, Blanche Kennedy at the University of Denver. Prevention. People tried masks, they tried vaccines, they tried sprays, and these things were effective. I'm told that masks don't do anything for viruses. Vaccines, the people were injecting all kinds of serums into patients and into rabbits and into guinea pigs, trying to come up with a vaccine. And evidence is that none of this was very effective. The best treatment was should I try this now? The best treatment, am I off? Okay. The best treatment was rest, good nutrition, warmth, good nursing care to prevent the pneumonia. So, next slide, please. This is at the Naval Training Station in San Francisco. This is a lot of patients, a lot of people to care for. These are drapes around the beds to prevent transmission. Again, a lot of supplies, a lot of personnel, a lot of space, a lot of energy trying to fight this, and a lot of blankets and a lot of tea. Influenza was debilitating to the individual. Many were sick for weeks and days. It was debilitating to the military, and it consumed enormous amount of resources. And I was in the National Archives last summer doing some TB research, but I'm always looking for flu, and I came across Camp Wadsworth, South Carolina records. They had a non-effective rate of 50% in late September, and it approached 100% the first week of October. 100% non-effective rate. How do you fight a war with 100% non-effective rate? How do you do anything? Again, George Soper, who wrote about this in Science magazine, said, "Rarely before in the history of war has infection exhibited a more explosive character or has so large a proportion of troops been affected in camps under conditions of abundant shelter and food and freedom from the strains and the anxieties of conflict." And then he added in a fairly low key, "The epidemic had been attended by unusual fatality." The American Expeditionary Forces. Next slide, please. I feel like I'm kind of coming on too strong, but I'm trying to make a point. This was bad. This is really bad. The records for the American Expeditionary Force are not as complete as the training camps. It's very frustrating for scholars. But we know there were 2 million soldiers in France, and a morbidity rate of a conservative 20% would have 400,000 sick people in France. A 25% morbidity rate would have 500,000 sick people in France. And they would all need doctors, nurses, supplies, transportation. I was able to find some witnesses from the French experience. One of them is a nurse who was working at a base hospital in Argonne. And if you know the military history of World War I, the United States didn't really get involved until 1918. We only were involved in 13 battles. But the 2 biggest battles, the 2 World War I size battles, were the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, that was in early September, and then the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, that begins in late September, both during the epidemic. A nurse wrote from a base hospital in the Argonne, "To care for hundreds and hundreds pouring in, suffering with influenza and pneumonia, we were equipped for less than 1/2 the number admitted and were necessarily obliged to compromise everything in order to cope with the situation. Imagine having 280 patients and 6 medicine glasses. For 2 days, we were the busiest. All the water was turned off. No lights after dark, and on cloudy days, that was 4 p.m. Intermittent Bosch planes, it's a German planes, were over us day and night with constant firing from anti-aircraft guns and often shrapnel and machine guns. How grateful our boys were for the very little nursing we could give them, to warm them as quickly as possible on arrival, to keep them so with hot drinks, hot food, and a pair of woolen socks is most essential. And then she said, I never want to see another case of pneumonia following influenza. It is a dreaded disease that is filling our AEF cemetery fast. Harry Presley is another witness. He was a law student from Nebraska, so he was literate, apparently. And he was serving in the military police in Brest, France. And he got sick in September and was hospitalized for 10 days. But he didn't like it. You know, he wanted to be where the action was. He wanted to get up. So the first time he tried to get out of bed, he fell on the floor. And he wrote home, he said, and this, I just love this quote, I'm feeling better, I think. I got to spitting up blood yesterday and today, and so I called on the doctor, and he examined me with the stethoscope and couldn't find anything wrong. Just a little blood spitting up, right? So the medical officer told Presley as long as his temperature was normal, he was okay. But he was not okay. He recovered very slowly, but he ended up losing 30 pounds. And he went from 142 pounds to 110 pounds from influenza. So, mitigation. Since my book came out, the University of Michigan researchers have done a study with the CDC to study the effect of influenza in US cities during the epidemic. And they looked at the response of 43 cities. And what did these cities do? Did they close the schools? And they looked at what they called non-pharmaceutical measures or social distancing. And they looked at these cities, and the social distancing at this time was school closures, banning public gatherings, and isolation and quarantine. And then this study correlated these social distancing measures with the death rates in the cities. Next slide, please. Oh, there's my nurse. Okay, that's my nurse. I think I have some more pictures from France. So we'll look at these pictures and then I'll look at my chart. So there's a nurse in France wearing a mask and getting water out of a fire plug. Next slide, please. And these are patients from a hospital in France with their blankets and being kept up so they don't develop pneumonia in their lungs. Yeah.
Get away from the AEF. Did the war affect the Germans, the enemy, the same as it was affecting us?
Yes.
In Europe?
Yes. I was at a, and of course no one wanted to tell anybody. All of this was under censorship. And people call it the Spanish flu, and I don't, because it's a misnomer. And the reason it was called the Spanish flu was because Spain was not involved. Oh, I think I'm doing something here. Spain was not involved in the war, and so they were reporting their epidemic. Whereas the British and the French and the Germans, no one else was reporting their sickness rates because it was a security issue. But I was at a conference in France last year, a year before, and there was a scholar who had just finished a study of influenza in the German army, and it was as bad as it was for us. But I'm going to argue that the Germans had been fighting, and the French had all been fighting the war for 4 years, and so they had a military history This flu totally overlapped with our military experience. And so it changes the experience for us, I believe. Next slide, please. Okay, there they are with them. This is also in France, wearing the masks and having the sheeting. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Okay. Mitigation. So this study looked at 43 cities, and there's the map. And they found that cities that had put in place mitigation measures early and kept them in had lower mortality rates. And so this is one city. I think this is, I can't tell you which cities there are, but I have the study for you. But this actually, I do know, this is Denver here. And there's a hump here, and this is after they get rid of the mitigation measures, they lift the mitigation measures, and then the death rate goes up. So they've tracked that mitigation measures do suppress some of the impact. And what Howard Markel at the University of Michigan says, that the goal for influenza now is to, because we know we can't stop it. But we can flatten out the curve and delay the curve and give it, if we know it's coming, then we can get the vaccine out and the measures out and then make sure this curve comes later and doesn't go as high. And so that would be the goal. But I can recommend that article to you. Questions about mitigation? It's pretty straightforward. But again, it's very hard because one thing that happens is there's a fourth Liberty Loan drive in October. And that proceeds because that's the way they're funding the war. And so people are going out, marching, recruiting for Liberty loans during an epidemic. Is that a question?
Yes, ma'am. In the context of military, but perhaps maybe the greater public, when you talk about the mitigation strategies, specifically they sound like that they're action in terms of school closures and banning public gatherings and quarantines. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how they handled it in terms of like an inform and influence of the people. Like how was this information communicated to the larger public? How were they informed about it? You talked a little bit about that it was censored, but at what point did they decide we need to let people know about this? How did they do so, and how did the people respond?
Well, they knew about it. It was in the paper every day. So the newspapers. There isn't radio. It's posters and newspapers and bulletins. And in the military, the Surgeon General is just sending out flyers every day to the hospitals and the camps and the bases. So there are, yeah.
At what point in the timeline can you kind of indicate that that happens?
It varies, and that's one of the arguments here is that some cities were slower than others. So the military is centralized, and so the military is operating, some camps were better at their jobs than others, but they all have the same policies generally. The cities don't. The cities have different public health officers, they have different public health setups, and they also have the spatial difference. Boston didn't really see it coming as quickly, but San Francisco and Denver had a chance. So there is a time lag, and there's the politics of each. And so one phenomenon is that each city and each state has its own flu history. And it depends on some people did masks, other people didn't do masks. But it's hard to close your schools. So does that answer your question? I don't have that expertise for the civilian experience, but it varies very much by state and by city.
Thank you.
But people were, the people were informed. So, next slide, please. One of the challenges when you're writing a book is, so what? So what if a lot of people got sick? And so what if a lot of people died? What does it matter other than the fact that the people died? And I looked at the two major battles that the United States fought and said, what impact did this flu have on the conduct of these battles? And there isn't, military historians do not talk about the impact of disease very much. There's a silence there. And I find military medical history fascinating, but under-attended to. Many military historians don't deal with the medical aspects. They're more interested in strategy and in hardware. Medical historians don't really approve of the military, or they skip over wars. But there is so much going on at the nexus of those two. And it's happening during the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. The Battle of Saint-Mihiel went quite well. The British were, the Germans were retreating, and so that was not, there were not many problems with the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. But the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, from September 24th to November 11th, began very badly for the United States. And there was a breakdown after the first assault, and there was they halted the assault and started it after a couple of days. And there's a lot of drama around those early days. There were very high casualty rates during the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. There was an army of 1.2 million, and there were 120,000 casualties. That's a 10% casualty rate, which is higher than the other armies. And so people have said, what was wrong with the Americans? You know, the Americans had come over here, and the Germans and the French, and the British and the French were afraid that the Americans wouldn't know how to fight. They hadn't been familiarized with industrial warfare, and they might not do very well. During this Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, there's this upsetting phenomena of stragglers. And there are estimates of about 100,000 stragglers during the war. And these are people that have lost their units and are wandering around. And the question is, what's going on with these soldiers? Are they afraid? Are they not good soldiers? And what do I say? I say, what about influenza? Are these people sick? Are these people feverish? And I think we need to look at that and consider that when we look at the performance of the Army. And so let me point to the case of Frank Holden, who is, again, a lawyer. I got to go with the people who write. You know, if they don't write their memoirs, you don't get to find out what they did. So Frank Holden was the 82nd Division. He was a lawyer from Georgia, and he ends up running in the Georgia State Legislature. But he got the flu at the second week of October during the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. And he describes how it took him 2 days to get from the front to the rear. And one of the problems with the Meuse-Argonne, all the historians talk about, is a traffic jam. There's a huge traffic jam between the front and the supply lines, and it's all a traffic jam. Frank Holden was part of that traffic jam. It took him 2 days to get from the front to the hospital in the rear. And he explains how it happened. About daybreak, everybody left the tent but me. I tried to get up, but I could not. I had such a pain in my head and chest and was suffering so that I was unable to get up with the others. My chest felt as though needles were sticking into it when I tried to cough. After breakfast, several came in and felt my head and said I had a fever. So the doctor examined him, he's at the front, and he had a fever of 103. Holden begged him not to be sent to the rear, and he said, no, I won't get in an ambulance, send the wounded. Because a lot of these guys didn't feel worthy. I wasn't wounded in combat, don't send me. But he said, I wished I had been wounded, because most of them were only slightly wounded and were not suffering. They were laughing and joking. And he said, I was laying there thinking of my mother, because I thought I was dying, and you know who you want by your side when we feel we are about to leave this world. Very few ever have the experience of feeling that they are dying and live to tell it. And so he spends the day in his tent, and he's finally put on a truck, carried back to a field hospital. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the crowded conditions of the trenches where the disease can spread. Next slide. And so every time somebody's moved, it takes people to move them. And so stretchers were 2 people or 4 people. Next slide, please. And then the ambulances. So Frank Holden got carried to a field hospital behind the lines, and he sleeps next to a cot by the stove for a day. And then, next slide, please. He's put on a train, and he goes back to a base hospital where he spends 2 weeks. This is during the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. He's sent back to active duty, and the commander saw that I'd gotten out of the hospital too soon and was very weak. I couldn't walk 100 yards without having to stop and rest. Most of the boys in my old battalion told me how thin, weak, and bad I looked. And so this is, again, one guy's experience in the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. So 20 to 40% morbidity rates. Next slide, please. Historians don't write about this, and military histories don't write about this. And so as a graduate student, I would get insecure, and I would say, well, am I imagining this? Are these? And then I would go to this chart. This is hospital admissions chart. This is a hospital admissions chart on the front of the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, and these are ditto marks for influenza. That's an epidemic. That is an epidemic, and that is what these people were experiencing in France. There is a controversy about what to do with flu patients. They're at the front. They're clogging up the hospitals. That's a word that one person uses. And so they say, we don't need these flu patients at the front. Let's evacuate them to the rear. And then if they get evacuated, it takes maybe a day. Then they can come down with pneumonia. And so then the Surgeon General of the AAF says, do not evacuate, because that develops pneumonia. And so they were required to hold the flu patients. So there's this whole problem. What do you do with these guys? Do you evacuate them, or do you take care of them there, risking pneumonia? So what are the consequences? So my argument, and this, I'm still waiting to have this picked up by military historians. And one of the things I do is I take books on World War I, and I look at the battle, and I go to the index and look at influenza. I look for influenza to see what they say. And I think this story needs to be integrated more into the military history. After the war, Congress had hearings, and I always like to read congressional hearings because I used to work for Congress, and all of this has public policy consequences. And the congressional delegation of Kansas was very upset or outraged by the high casualty rate of the 35th Division. And so they demanded hearings. And at the 35th Division, I read, this is 2 days of hearings, and I went through the hearing record, and I did not see a mention of influenza. The only mention I saw was the statement that 7,000 men, wounded, sick, gassed, exhausted, were evacuated. They evacuated 7,000 men, which would be about 25% of a division at that time. Secretary of War Newton Baker thought that was a high number, but he did acknowledge there were 10,000 replacements for the 35th Division. Well, what are they replacing? And there were only 827 men killed in action or died of wounds. And so, could it be that this was influenza that was causing these high casualty rates? Could it be that this was influenza that was causing the traffic jams? Could it be that it was influenza that was causing this straggling? And these people aren't keeping records of all this because they're fighting a war and they're busy. But this is something we need to start integrating into our understanding of our performance at that time. So, consequences for the US military, consequences for the homeland, also consequences for individuals. Consequences for individuals. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Ward McNeil. Ward McNeil was one of my medical officers. He was a MD, PhD bacteriologist at the University of Columbia, and at Columbia University. And he joined up for the war, and he fought on the front lines of the epidemic. He operated the laboratory in Dijon, France. And his job was to go out and inspect camps that were having epidemics. He oversaw the lab tests, and he did dozens of autopsies on patients or on the deceased to try to understand what happened. All these autopsies, pathology was very important. What is killing these young people? Ward McNeil filed the first official report on the influenza epidemic to the Office of the Surgeon General. This is published later in early 1919. And then he went home, sailed home, and to New Jersey. And he expected a warm homecoming when he arrived in New Jersey. But he was surprised to find only one of his sons, Herbert, at the station to meet him. His other two sons, Perry and Edward, had the flu. And their mother, his wife, Mabel, was home taking care of them. And so McNeil went home to New Jersey and with his wife, Mabel, cared for their two boys. Perry soon recovered, but Eddie became weaker and weaker. And despite his medical degree, despite his PhD in bacteriology, despite his knowledge, his intimate knowledge of influenza, Ward McNeil could do nothing for his son. And 5 days after he got home, Eddie died, age 12. And McNeil did an autopsy on him. McNeil did an autopsy on his son to understand what happened. And he found that it was bacterial endocarditis. An infection had gotten into his son's heart and killed him. And so this is a global catastrophe, but it had incredibly personal consequences. And how do I know this story? I know this story because Ward McNeil's daughter, Ruth, wrote a short story about it. And she believed that Eddie's death was a defining moment in her father's life. He failed. He could not save his own son. And he sublimated his sorrow, as she said, quoting her, in doing research into endocarditis for the rest of his life, trying to understand this. So it was traumatizing at very different levels. Let me close by saying these are very, well, I'm not quite closing, but I'm getting close. After the war, next slide, please. Oh, that's an autopsy table. Again, a lot of pathology done. Next slide, please. After the war, There is a lot published on the influenza. The annual report of 1919 for the War Department has several hundred pages on the epidemic. The medical department published a 15-volume history of the medical experience in World War I, which my students are doing a lot of research in. And 3 of the volumes concern influenza, communicable diseases, pathology, sanitation. Medical officers published all kinds of papers on their experiences with influenza. But if you read the histories, you read very little. I said I go to the bookstore, I look through the index, very little about influenza in World War I. Influenza is getting more attention. Look at us here. But for much of the 20th century, people did not really recognize this epidemic. And it's baffling. And some of the, Martin Gilbert and John Keegan, 2 of the major historians of World War I, barely mentioned this, the worst plague in human history. They do not mention it. Another book that I saw had a chart that noted 62,000 deaths in the Army, but didn't explain it. David Kennedy has 5 lines in a 350-page book. Where do we get this? What is this about? Next slide, please. Except for the flu. As a historian, I would see this construction in medical officers. George Soper, and we know what he said about, we've heard about what he said about the flu. He said, had it not been for the pneumonia, the pandemic would not have attracted much attention. What does that mean? Paul Woolley, who was in charge of one of the camps as a medical officer, taken as a whole, the incidence of disease, except for the epidemic of influenza, is what may be called normal. Another guy said, Masrick Ravenel said, anyone interested in preventive measures and wishing to demonstrate the efficiency of modern methods would be glad to pass this disease in silence. And so I see in the record, I have a collection, that's another thing I did is I just kept, I have a chapter in my book called Except for the Flu. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? And so kind of not looking at this influenza, but if you're familiar, there's a book called The Soldiers of the Great War. And it has portraits of all the men who died, organized by state. And there's a picture. That's one of the pages. It's online. Next slide, please. It tells you what they died of. And it has KA, killed in action, DW, died of wounds, and DD, died of disease. Died of disease, died of disease, died of disease. The flu had consequences for these guys and their families. And so I think it's really good that you're looking at the power that disease has to rattle us, to disrupt us, and to kill us. And I'm happy to tell my cautionary tale about the power of disease in society. So thank you very much. Okay. I'll take questions. Yeah.
Are there any questions?
Any more questions?
Are there any statistics that they go through the backgrounds of the soldiers that died, 36,000 who got here?
Yeah.
You know, from the rural farmland versus the city?
Oh, there's a lot of statistics on that. And they really, really tried to understand that. And there's really no rhyme or reason. It's the age. And They're practicing eugenics at the time, and so they're trying to make racial explanations, they're trying to make ethnic explanations, and none of those make any sense. So, no, it's hard. And there's a debate. One of the questions is, if you look at nation to nation, what are the death rates in nations that have lower standards of living versus nations that have higher standards of living? And it's pretty much the same. We are finding that in Africa and India, where there's no health care, then there are higher rates of mortality, and we might find mortality rates of 8% to 10%. But there isn't a lot of difference in the more developed countries. So it's hard to find an epidemiological explanation. But that I say as being a historian and not a scientist. So bad answer, but I mean good answer, but not very satisfactory. Sir.
Yes, ma'am. I actually have 2 questions. On the, I believe with the Chesney study that you did.
Yes.
Was there any indication in your research that the patients who had developed the flu earlier, when it was less virulent and less lethal, did they gain any immunity from the later, more lethal version that it evolved into?
That's a really good question, and that is something that Howard Markel and David Morens are trying to answer. And this is where they get in, I gave you that article, this is where they get into this conundrum and stupefying. So the thought is, there is some immunity. And so the solution that the Army came up with in September was, and I'll use this to tell a story. Acting Army Surgeon General was saying, we can't be shipping out troops from camps that have epidemics in them. And we can't be cramming them in on ships. And so he is asking for a stop to this, and Peyton March will have none of that, and neither will Pershing. Pershing was more sensitive to the role of the flu, and Pershing was kind of on top of the flu. I was always impressed with Pershing and the flu. But Richards, the acting Surgeon General, then says, well, what about reducing the percentage of people on the ships? So can we reduce it by 15%? And this goes to President Wilson. President Wilson then says, why is the Surgeon General trying to stop us shipping? And Peyton March says, you know, we've got to fight the Germans. And so all they do is reduce the crowding on the ships by 15%. And some of the stories on the ships are horrible. What they figure out, and this is what I was going to say, what they figure out in October is to just ship out men from camps that had already had their epidemic. So once the epidemic had passed, then they could ship men out, and that was a much better experience. So yes, there was immunity. As far as the first wave is concerned, I can't speak specifically to that, but there was immunity after the big one. Right.
When they had them in those places, the aid stations, the field hospitals, were they keeping them, in most cases, isolated from the wounded patients, or did they just all have them in the same ward?
They were trying to have segregated wards, yes. There was a sense of cross-infection. But I have one guy who was gassed. This isn't interesting. He was gassed, and he woke up in a flu ward. And that's what you looked like with the flu. You looked like you'd been gassed. So it was hard to tell, but that's, again, just an anecdote. But they were segregating them, yes.
Just an observation. On this sheet you passed out, it has Camp Crafts, which was right here at Fort Salem.
Mm-hmm.
There were 12,000 people that were sick
Yeah.
at Fort Salem. And we worked in the early 2000 when we worked at, that was the old hospital, so that was probably a busy place in 1980.
It was a busy place, and they had tents. They had to put up tents, and they were bringing in doctors and nurses from the local communities. I mean, one of the phenomena of the influenza epidemic is that the Army would not allow African American nurses until the influenza epidemic. And so there are only like, I believe, 11 black women in the Army Nurse Corps, and they are hired to take care of flu victims. So but bringing people in to care for the patients. Other questions? Yes.
On the one hand, you showed almost the migration of the disease from
Right.
the endeavors over to Chicago. But also, prior to World War I, soldiers were recruited and units were formed locally or by the state. This was World War I was the first war where we actually recruited and formed units from across the nation.
Right, exactly.
So did that play a role as well of as individuals came together, you know, versus just a sequential?
Yes, but we see that the most in the fall of 1917, when, as you know, you bring thousands of people together from the rural areas and they all share their germs. And they don't do that well. And so there are epidemics of measles and mumps in the training camps in November and December. And it's a problem of poor mobilization, and they don't have wool uniforms yet, and they built the armory before they built the hospitals, and that is a problem. And there are some deaths from pneumonia from there. So, but when the flu comes, it's hard to say that the flu virus is brought in from the rural areas. And there is a lot of discussion about these farm boys that are not exposed to germs, and that the city boys are more fit. But when you have a 25%, 40% morbidity rate, it's hard to really say that that makes a difference. Yes?
So this is going through the Army, this is going through our families and
Yes.
such as well.
Yes.
Do you know of what kind of effect that had on people who were deployed, the whole Army effort to work?
Well, the willingness to deploy, there was a draft, so that was not a matter of willingness anymore, and there was a very strong war spirit in the country. So no, it didn't really interfere with that. The problem was that there was a shortage of medical personnel in the civilian world, because the medical personnel had gone into the military, and the medical equipment had gone into the military. And so they're bringing retired medical officers back to the military, they're bringing students in, and so there's concern about the lack of medical personnel. If you're aware of the influenza of 1918, just go to any small town cemetery and look, and you find headstones from 1918, and it's young people. And you don't find a lot, but you find some. And so a colleague of mine, Nancy Bristow, wrote a book on the social aspects of influenza called American Pandemic. And she talks about the personal toll that it took, and about the lack of memory that it's a personal memory that we hold rather than a social memory. But that, I think, is changing as we start looking at it anew.
Thanks, Dr. Miley, for raising Three highlights I think we should take away as a staff. Number one, that science has not conquered PIID, and that this could happen again in the future. Two, we should think about how this should inform our planning efforts, what type of DISC emissions we should be thinking of in this type of environment. And I think just as important or more important, how do we operate as a staff when you hear that these infection rates are so high? So I encourage you all to go back to your staffs, think about this, inform our planning efforts as we move forward with PIID, and then also come prepared for the next staff professional development on February 18th, 1500 at the Roadrunner Center. Sir, I don't know if you had a few words.
First off, thank you very much. Having been the commander of Big Red 1 at Fort Riley, Kansas, and having gone and done personal tours with Camp Funston, and actually listened to survivors from World War II that talked about family members that actually resided at Camp Funston and the terror it absolutely had. And there's a lot of rumors out there on how it started. Some of them even go back to Native American Indians. And so, I thought when I came and sat in here, I wasn't going to learn a whole lot, to be honest with you. But what I did learn, and I'll tell you, I'm going to take out of this specifically, is really the slant you took on it. We're a part of the problem, those of us in uniforms. If you didn't realize it, that map that the chief basically talked about that showed the migration, could you imagine in 13 years of persistent conflict what we've been doing today if an influenza broke out similar and we didn't address it in our own ranks? We do a great job of talking about how we're going to address this from defense support civilian authorities, but I don't necessarily know if we've discussed this at length with the Surgeon General here in the Home of Army Medicine, for example, and how we employ measures in order to restrict or to mitigate, as you saw upon the slide presentation, if it happens within our own ranks. Because we have an inherent moral obligation to the country that we serve in uniform to not only protect them against enemies, foreign and domestic, but also to protect them against that unseen enemy that's out there. And so, we have a lot of practices that we do. We bring guys together for formation to train up, and then we normally send them out for 2 weeks of R&R before they deploy. In this particular situation, every one of those pieces and things that we've done through our deployment model, I wonder if we've done it with an eye toward looking at those things. So I really opened my eyes toward, do we really have a plan for those of us that we're the cloth of the nation as we go out there, and really the obligation that we have. The other thing it ought to tell you is that this thing can happen at any time, and we have to be prepared. And that's why really I've asked the staff and really the planners to really get after this, because the American people have high expectations that we're going to be able to respond and we're going to do it right. And studying history enables you to not run through the same brick wall. Although this happened many years ago, there are lessons that correlate to today. And really, when you take a look at it, the thing that wasn't highlighted specifically, but she mentioned it, is really the emotional and the psychological impact on soldiers. When your families are impacted as well, that is something that we're going to have to address and deal with. I mean, I just thought it was, you could write a whole other book on that one doctor.
Yeah.
I mean, what an absolute sad state, but the fact that he was so driven that he was able to do an autopsy on his own son, to me, that's a great deal of love, but it's also a great deal of what she said, a failure, and feeling it and internalizing. So those are areas where we got to take a look as well. So I truly appreciate you coming here and doing this, because now I'm going to go back and do some reading on some things and maybe look at this through a different lens. We have a tendency to always look at it from the outside. We're in our foxhole, and we have a tendency. Now I think it's a perspective we need to look internally as well. So I do ask the planners to do that, and we will draw upon your expertise to help us out, if you don't mind. What we have here, and you heard some of the history that we share here at Fort Sam with some of the research that you did. Fort Sam has got a very colorful history, and as you drive around, you see a lot of historic buildings. Some of us work in those buildings. Some of us actually live in those buildings. And it's a neat place to be and be a part of. But it is transitioned, and now it is considered the home of Army medicine, and there are a number of facilities here that are really the jewel of our military with regards to our medicine. And I'd like to present you with this small book about Fort Sam Houston.
Well, thank you
so
very
you can
much.
read it on your plane flight back to Colorado. One of the few places I think you can actually get back into based on the weather.
Right.
And then please accept this small token. It's
Oh, wow,
and,
look at that.
basically commemorating your...
My name on it.
Yeah, it does. See, we're quick. We're not bad. We're really quick. But, really as a token of our appreciation for coming here and sharing with us. And we appreciate the opportunity that you gave us to ask questions.
Oh, yeah.
Because, that's important as well. So I'd ask you, is if you come up with questions or you're too embarrassed, if you're sitting here in a room, don't hesitate to come up and ask questions. That's probably where you'll get the most information. And so I thank you very much for that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.